Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Kunis, and I'm the projects coordinator at the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. DRGP works to preserve and enhance the Delaware River's natural, cultural, and recreational resources, with education being a cornerstone of our mission. Please save the date for our next Heritage Lecture, which will be on May 28th at 7:30 p.m., featuring Charlie Groff from Lewis Island Fishery, just in time for shad season. Registration will open at the end of next week. Now, allow me to introduce you to our speaker, Amy Hollander. Amy is a Historic Resources Manager at Bucks County Parks and Recreation. In this role, she offers the blog Bucks Bygone Byways and recently appeared in the Bucks County Herald's 250 Revolutionary Reels. Amy's also the author of the graphic novel Low Bridge, Everybody Down, which shares the real-life experiences of Jimmy Brown. Today's presentation is sponsored by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Amy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm talking to you about a project that I've been working on for the last couple of years that's very close to my heart. It's the amazing graphic novel about the life and times of Jimmy Brown. Jimmy Brown was a local man. I mean, if you're all here because you're passionate about the river, this was a man who was born and raised along the Delaware River. He was a black canal boat captain on the Delaware and Lehigh Canals, and he was born in Bristol in 1900. When he was 10 years old, he ran away from home to become a mule driver on the canal. And he famously, according to himself, went down the canal at 10 years old, flagged down Captain Schuylkill Elliott and asked him for a job. And he worked for Captain Elliott for 2 years. Captain Elliott was killed in 1912, but Jimmy stayed on the canal and was taken in by another captain, Captain Free. And by 1915, he was given a contract to serve as a captain on for the Lehigh Navigation Company. And in 1921, he had raised enough money serving as a captain to buy his own boat and his own mule team. And he worked on the canal for the remaining years of the canal's life. So when it closed in October of 1931, Jimmy found himself without a career. Now, I was brought on this project in August of 2023. I was approached by the National Canal Museum to coordinate and write a graphic novel about the life of Jimmy Brown, which would need to do three things: share the story of Jimmy Brown and highlight how his story fits into the larger history of the canal and of the Black experience during this era. Now, that's a tall order for a 44-page book. The idea for the graphic novel grew out of an earlier project the National Canal Museum had undertaken. It was funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to document the lives of Black canal workers in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. After doing this work, they created an amazing story map which documented the existence of 70 Black canal workers who worked along the canal corridors of the tri-state area. It was an interactive story map where each dot represented the home of a Black canal worker. And when you clicked on those dots, you were able to see census records, photos, and links if they're there for deeper dives into the history of those characters, one of whom was Jimmy Brown. Now, Jimmy Brown had also, on top of all of these documentary records, oral histories that were recorded. In 1982, he recorded his first oral history for the National Canal Museum. And in 1985, he attended the first of many annual Canaler reunions at the museum, where more oral histories were recorded by both Jimmy and his fellow Canalers. So this is one of our only pictures of Jimmy. This is him blowing the conch shell. If any of you have visited the Canal Museum, you know that the conch shell was how the canal boat drivers could alert the lock tenders that they were coming down the lock. Now, without these oral histories, I would never have undertaken this project. Two of them were recorded on cassette tape, but one was videotaped. Now, Jimmy stood about 5 feet tall, but he was larger than life. In his recordings, he shared his story in such detail that I could picture each anecdote in my mind. Now, the majority of the events in the graphic novel came from these oral histories, and they allowed me to present an authentic tale using Jimmy's own words and described experiences. Now, the recordings were very detailed, but they were focused almost entirely on his life in the canal. And one thing I want to point out, so we have some pictures of Jimmy when he was older and visiting in the 1980s, but this is the only documented image of Jimmy Brown working on the canal. And for those of you who are familiar, this building here is the Golden Pheasant, and Jimmy's the mule driver over here, walking the mule for his captain. Now, my main challenge was to weave Jimmy's story within the context of broader historical events at the time. And so, in order to do this, because Jimmy really only talked about his life on the canal, I turned to newspaper accounts and regional and local histories to find the historical beats which likely impacted Jimmy's life. So, boatman strikes, the end of World War I, the canal closing, all of these stories helped fill in the gaps for fleshing out the life of Jimmy in the graphic novel. Now, the novel was going to be used, it was being developed as a middle school outreach program. And so, in order to make sure that what we were creating connected with our audience, we engaged a panel of local 7th to 9th grade history teachers to review the content and to make sure it was relevant and connected with their curriculum. And throughout the process, with each step, we would go back to the teachers and make sure that we were still on target for what we were creating. On top of that, we wanted to make sure that we were being culturally sensitive. And so our material was shared at different stages of development with the Lafayette College professor who serves as the Canal Museum's diversity chair. So my first step was to create a narrative outline. Jimmy's oral histories were filled with optimism. They spoke very little of prejudice on the canal. And when we shared our outline with the teachers, their feedback was that it seemed too idealistic, that there was too little made of prejudice on the canal. But while I agreed that that felt like the tone and that it might not reflect the true prejudice that Jimmy faced, I didn't want to report events of prejudice without some evidence. So my next step was to start listening to all the oral histories that the Canalers recorded, looking for other people's take on what was happening on the canal and looking for specific references to what they saw Jimmy going through. So this picture here shows the Free family, and we have John Free, who was Jimmy's captain from 1915 on, and his wife Rosa, and Jimmy lived with them from 1912 through till the 1915, 16 years. So these people were very close to him. One of the oral histories that I listened to was of their daughter Madeline. Um, she shared some information, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that was really important to developing the graphic novel. But it was the oral history of a man named Harry Lighthlighter, who was the son of one of Jimmy's friends, that really shone a light on some of the prejudice that Jimmy faced that he was unwilling to talk about in his interviews. There were several times when he was prodded to discuss some of these darker events, and he just would say, you know, sticks and stones will break my bones, but the names will never hurt me. And that was his default answer. So with Harry, we found about this powerful memory, an event when a group of young, drunk men on the canal tried to drown Jimmy, accusing him of rising above his station to become a captain. These are some of the local men. I don't have Henry Lighthlighter, but these are some of the people that Jimmy worked with on a daily basis. From Madeline Free, what we heard was that Jimmy loved music, that he loved to dance, and that the Free family loved music as well. So this is Madeline Free here. And she talks about the family building a stage in the backyard and doing regular, bringing bands and music in and having regular dances in the Erwinna community. And that the best dancer of all was Jimmy, and her favorite thing to do was to dance with him. So because of this, I took the opportunity to weave in the birth of the Harlem Renaissance, which is paralleling this time in Jimmy's life. You have the birth of the blues with W.C. Handy. You have amazing blues singers like Mamie Smith, and with record songs like Crazy Blues. And you have dances like the Charleston, which are going across the country. And all of these seem to be something that we might want to highlight in the story. However, I wanted to make sure that as a historian, that these songs, these dances, that Jimmy would have had access to them living here in Bucks County in the Lehigh Valley. And so through research, I was able to learn that there were bands playing in the Lehigh Valley, playing this music to sold out crowds at this time. Paul Whiteman played at Mealy's Auditorium multiple times, every time to sold out crowds. And the dance steps of the latest music were actually published on the front page of the local paper. So this is the Morning Call. And the Swanee Bottom is a variation on the Charleston. And on the very front page of the paper, they're showing these dance steps in 1926, right when I have Jimmy talking about dancing them. Now, all of this is enough to suggest that Jimmy would have known the music at least, but I don't have a ticket stub. But realistically, he could have been in any of these places in the 1920s and seen and heard this music. Another area where I tried to bring in one of the beats was that in the graphic novel, Jimmy attends the performance of Booker T. Washington, who's one of the most famous Black educators, lecturers, and leaders in the time. who actually spoke twice in the Lehigh Valley, once in 1902 and a second time in 1914. And so it is very likely and possible that Jimmy, even though we don't have a ticket stub, might have attended this standing room only sold out performance. There are other places where I used creative license in the story. I wanted to share the impact of major events like World War I in the pages. And so it wasn't hard to find out that right in Erwinna, where Jimmy was living, was a man, a young boy actually, named Clarence Weaver, a young man who in real life from that town enlisted in the war and was killed in action. Now, I don't know if they were friends, but they certainly would have known each other, and it would have had an impact on Jimmy as well as all the people who lived in Erwinna. Another important historical moment was the 1915 canal strike, and we include that in the pages of the graphic novel. It was an important part of the Delaware and Lehigh Canal history. But Jimmy Brown was likely, as a young black mule driver, not very knowledgeable that it was happening, and certainly not in the room when the captains met to decide whether they would strike or not. Now, in order to write a graphic novel, I was tasked with actually creating a script which described each panel in detail so that our amazing artist, Will Rosado, could bring the words to life. So it wasn't just writing the words in the dialogue bubbles. I had to determine how many panels would be on the page, what time of day was in each panel, what did the landscape look like, what perspective did I want it to show, who was going to be in the scene. So in the end, it wound up looking much more like a movie script than what the actual graphic novel appeared when printed. And just to give you a sense, this is the original layout pages. So the way that I worked with the artist is he read the script, he drafted some sketches, we discussed them, made alterations till we got to a place where we really felt like the images were doing what we wanted, and then he started to make more formal drawings. Now, one of the things that so this is the layout, and this are the formal line drawings of that page, just to give you a sense of the difference once we formalized things. So one of the things, the funny aspects of this is that I didn't realize at first how important it was to translate the historical content with the artist. So one of the first panels that he sketched out was this one here, which was a kitchen scene in Bristol, in the home that Jimmy grew up in. And I had just simply said kitchen. So Will sent me a lovely picture with a refrigerator and a modern stove, and I realized that I had to give him the details of a kitchen circa 1910, when none of these inventions existed. And so a stove looked very different. So realizing this fairly quickly, we knew that we had to help Will out a little bit more than even the detailed descriptions in the script. So we created a slide deck for him. And the slide deck showed him the people, the places, what a boat from that time period would look like, a general store, some of the people in the story, the butcher's wagon, and later some of the auditoriums and the Mack trucks that are talked about later as we look at how technology and the world is changing. Um, so now he has his slide deck, he has his script, he's done his layouts, and we're starting to work on really developing this narrative as a visual story. So I chose to separate Jimmy's life into 3 chapters. His first chapter is the one in which we establish the characters and the sense of place. It's really Jimmy's origin story, which for him begins iconically in every oral history that he records, with him at age 10 going down to the canal, flagging down a canal man and saying, "Hey, mister, can you give me a job?" Now, initially, we see his origin story about how he uh, runs away from school all the time, how he escapes into the country in a butcher wagon. He comes back and he's confronted by his father's girlfriend who threatens him that he can't skip school, and eventually leads to them discussing maybe sending him away and him deciding he's out of here. He's going to run away from home. He's not letting anyone tell him what to do. And eventually going down to the canal and flagging down Captain Elliot. But in between these memories, we also have to tell that story of life on the canal. Um, and as we're introducing him to the story, and we kind of take him on a 2-week journey from Bristol all the way up to Monchunk and back, we're introducing the reader to the life on the canal as well. So he's walking alongside Captain Elliot's kids, and they show him the ropes. They show him how to feed the mules. They share their meal with him because he's unprepared for his 20-mile walk. Um, and he learns how the canal works, and he sees all of the amazing things along the canal, um, general stores. He sees Bethlehem Steel. He's never seen places so different from his home. So for him, this is a grand adventure. But it's also some dreary toil and hard work. So one of Jimmy's favorite stories to recount is how when he was a mule driver early on, after walking for 20 miles, he would get tired and he would climb up on top of the mule and take a little ride, always somehow losing his cap along the towpath. This, of course, was scandalous. Captain Elliot's kids were very upset. The mules are more expensive than the boats, but Jimmy recounts this as sort of iconic of what his life was like on the canal. Now, in chapter 2, we begin to see the young boy is becoming a man, and he faces the tragic loss of his captain and the fear of being homeless and without work. Captain Schuylkill Elliot is killed in a terrible way. The whole title of this graphic novel is "Low Bridge, Everybody Down," is because the canal boats, when you went under the canal bridges, you had to duck. And one time, Captain Elliot didn't duck low enough, and he was hit by the bridge and was killed. And Jimmy was afraid that he would be without work, without a captain, but right away, Captain Free took him on. And not just took him on, but brought him into the family. And he stayed in Irwina with Captain Free and his family for many years. So in this story, we see him finding family and friends. We see him getting engaged in the business of canal work, so he's involved in the canal strike, but he also gets into shenanigans. So he has a good friend named Jackie Henry, and he and Jackie are, he tells all of these amazing stories of the trouble that the two of them get into. Um, and so the story is full of that life, and really gives you a sense of who Jimmy is, who his friends are, and who his family, his chosen family, becomes. Now, Jimmy also finds a mentor in Captain Nace, who is a black canal boat captain. And Captain Nace tries to prepare him for the prejudice he must face if he's going to achieve his dreams of becoming a captain. So it's Captain Nace who takes him to see Booker T. Washington, but it's also Captain Nace who gives him lectures when he sees Jimmy joking off the prejudice on the canal, um, the jokes that other captains make, the off comments. He says to Jimmy that he can't treat these things lightly because there's an underlying prejudice that he's going to have to face, a reality that he's going to have to deal with. Now, in chapter 3, Jimmy gets to be a captain and he should be incredibly excited, but he learns that there's a lot more challenge to being a captain than he really thought. And one of the favorite lines he repeats over and over in his oral histories is that nobody ever told him that a captain's got to keep his eyes open all the time. So his first problem was he can't afford a boat. He can't afford the mules. But Captain Free helps him out and says he can use his and slowly pay them off. Um, and so Jimmy decorates his boat with ribbons and flags, and nobody has ever seen a boat like Jimmy Brown's boat. But he's decorated, he's ready to go, but he cannot find anyone to work for him because he's a black man. And he's been trying to find for somebody for months, and he's so frustrated. And finally, he hires somebody that has a very questionable character, a man named Charlie Morrell. It doesn't go well. Charlie is known to be shady, and not months after Jimmy hires him, but the police come looking for him because he's broken into somebody's establishment as they've been going up and down the canal. And he's back to looking once again for somebody who he can find who's willing to work for him. So he tries again. And this time they come for him again. He's hired another young man, and this time he's found a young black man to work for him. But the police come because there's been reports that a young black man stole a chicken from a house up in the Lehigh Valley, and they've come for Jimmy. And Jimmy says it's not me, and his friends stand up for him and say it's not me. But the police says, well, take me to your boat and prove it. And he goes to the boat, and what does he find? A chicken that his mule driver has stashed in amongst the coal, and it's black as dust. So a friend lends him money to pay the fine, and he is fed up, and he finally has the brilliant idea to go to his sister and hire his nephew, who is 10, just like he was, to be the mule driver on his boat. Now, we talked a little bit about the World War I, and that becomes a part of the story. We see at the general store the announcement that the war has been declared, and everybody responds and reacts to it, thinking, how is this going to affect us here in this small town? And in the next panel, we see that one of the local boys is enlisting, and that everybody supports him and thinks, hey, he's being so brave. But then we see later that he's killed in action. And the the community has to deal with this loss. And that's another moment for us to bring in some of the music into the story. So Jimmy tells Captain Free and Rosa about Clarence being killed in action, and Mrs. Free sings Mamie Smith's song Crazy Blues. At this time, we're also talking about some of the race riots that are happening in Philadelphia at the time, and how worried the Frees are that it could affect Jimmy here at home. Now, also in this chapter is the shadow. So now we're looking at the shadow of change, right? Shipyards are being built overnight for the war effort. Networks are being constructed in Bucks County and Lehigh, and trucks are being mass produced by Mack Trucks for the war effort. And while all of this is being done for the war, these one day are going to be what replaces the canal as the primary industrial corridors for the country. Um, we also talk about women at the steel working while the men are fighting. Now, while all the old men, the captains are worried about all of this, Jimmy's all optimism, and he is constantly looking at the positive, and his oral histories just talk about, all the good things. And so it's another moment for us to bring in that music. So they're all talking about the demise of the canal, and he's off dancing, and trying to enjoy life. Um, Now, we talked earlier about this darker side of the canal. And so when he was being interviewed, the interviewers knew about this incident because of Harry Lechliter's story. But they would ask Jimmy, and they would say to him, "Didn't your friends once save you in the canal from drowning?" And he'd say, "Oh, I have great friends. It's a good thing I have them around." But he would never, no matter how they asked, he would never go into the story. But Harry tells it in detail because he was a young boy, and he came around the corner and he saw these five men attack Jimmy, throw him in the canal, and tried to drown him with poles. And it's Harry who ran and got Captain Free and his father Bill to come and rescue Jimmy. And they came, and they basically beat up these guys on the canal, and Harry pulled Jimmy out of the canal and saved him. Without this account, this story would have been lost. And I think that one of the valuable lessons that I learned in creating this graphic novel was that without these oral histories, there is a whole part of the story of the canal that nobody would have ever thought to tell. And a lot of our history is about unrecognized stories that today we are finding ways to pull that history and bring it forward. Now, when the canal closes in October of 1931, Jimmy finds himself without anything. He's lost his career. He's lost the canal life. And he could just be give up and be dejected, but that's not Jimmy, because Jimmy's an optimist. So he made a new life for himself. He winds up marrying Viola Nace, who was Captain Nace's niece in 1933. They met as young folk at some of the dances at Captain Freeze, and they stayed in touch over the years. And then we don't know as much about Jimmy's life afterwards. Again, the oral histories focus on the canal life. So we nobody asked him, what was your life like afterwards? Um, but we have records. We know he worked as a laborer in 1940, but by 1950, he was listed as working on the maintenance crew at an aluminum factory at Roll Manufacturing Company in Lansdale, PA, and he was there for 30 years. And, his oral histories don't discuss this time in his life, but we're talking to the man who has retired from this job. He's in his 90s, 80s, and 90s, and he is um, happy. He is positive, and I truly believe that he was a man with no regrets. And so our last panel is one that I've imagined. And it is that he may wonder what people back on the canal would think of him today, but he's probably still dancing. And he was probably still happy and positive um, in his approach to everything. Um, so my favorite part of this project was working with the artist Will Rosado to hone the details of the story as it came to life through his illustrations. So my words and my description to his layouts, to his line drawings, to the brilliant color palette that he developed in the graphic novel. This wasn't something that happened in a month. This was something that happened over several, a year and a half. And watching the story evolve and come to life and till it was a place where it jumped off the pages was um, really amazing to experience. But my second favorite part was holding the book in my hands. And it's been published. It is available for sale at the National Canal Museum. I think that they're going to be selling it online as well, but I don't think they have yet. But they're open Wednesday through Friday, 9:30 to 3:30 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday, 10:30 to 4:30 p.m. And maybe my talk was a little short, but that's because I'm hoping you all have questions that I can answer. Cindy, if you're talking, I can't hear you.
Yes, I was muted, of course. I don't see any questions yet, but we'll give people a few minutes to think about a question, put one down. I would just like to say this is a beautifully done book. I love his story. The illustrations are beautiful. Uh, I think it's awesome that you were able to work from recordings. How often does that happen from, that kind of history or that time period?
Honestly, so Will and I wound up having a pretty good rapport. So one of the things I knew I had done a good job when he uh started to ask me questions. Like he'd send me one of his layouts and he'd say, I have this all done, but what does a 1910 rug look like? Can you send me some patterns? Or we did a dinner. There was a a supper scene, and he said, "What would they have eaten in 1912?" And and so I had to talk to him about seasonality, right? Because in 1912, you're really just eating whatever is available locally. So, this is the season, so they would have had this to eat, and these vegetables and this meat would be available. So we were really able to um, uh, suss out, and he just started to intuitively know that there were questions. The big things like, there'd be a room and there would be electric light. Well, I don't know if they would have had electric light here at this time. So things like that where we just had to really look at the cells. And then the Canal Museum's historians also were really amazing because there were details that they were able to share about, you know, um, we had a big debate over the Bethlehem steel, the women in steel image, because we had to figure out where would he have been on the canal that he would have seen women walking to and from work. So what was the right backdrop? Now, none of us would know that, but the historians felt that we needed to depict a really accurate portrayal of these historical moments.
Okay, we have had a couple questions come in. Uh, One of them is, where is the Canal Museum? So I'm actually going to put the address there, but that is in Easton, PA.
It's in Easton. It's at Hugh Park, and I am going to add a little important comment. If you want to go this year, they are doing work starting in June on the bridge that it's an island. So from June through August, you will not be able to get there. It is an amazing museum. They do canal boat rides. I don't think it's inappropriate to comment on the fact that my husband is the canal boat captain. And he's incredibly knowledgeable about the canal, but this year it'll be a little bit tougher to get there because of the bridge work that they're doing. And then it should reopen again in the fall.
Wonderful. Do you have a birth and death date for Jimmy?
He was born in 1910, and I do have a death date. Hold on, 1995.
And here's another one. I may have missed it, but where did you discover Jimmy's oral history?
So the Canal Museum did the oral histories, but they are online through the Soulbury Historical Society, and you can listen to all of the canalers, but they also have the Pennsylvania Impressionists. They have like this massive group of really incredible recordings.
How did you find the illustrator?
So there was a graphic, I don't even want to call it a graphic novel because it was like huge, um, a huge book, like, a coffee table type book called Black Lives Always Mattered in Philadelphia, I think. Now I didn't find the original project was led by the Canal Museum, so they had seen this book, which inspired them to create the graphic novel. And through the gentleman who coordinated that book, each person that was in that graphic novel that was had a chapter with their story was done by a different artist. So we went through the book and said, "Oh, this is the artist we want." So we reached out to see if he would be willing, and he was incredibly excited about doing the book.
This is more of a comment. Interesting and impressive that a Black 15-year-old captain his own boat, not book, at that age. Lucky for him to gain the trust of Captain Free.
So he worked for, so we had to simplify the story. So Jimmy worked for a number of captains, and as a mule driver. And so when he went to apply to be a captain, they all te like gave testimony. But Captain Free was the one he lived and worked with the most. But he has in his oral histories, he talks about working for this one and that one and here and there. Um, the canal, the people who lived and worked on the canal were really a family. They were all interconnected, and he was very lucky because at this time, for a black man without any education, he ran away from school when he was 10, to have a position of management and leadership, to have the freedom to travel the canal. It was really a wonderful life, even with the problems that he had, the prejudice, the bias, and even this terrible attack that happened when he was in his 20s.
Okay, what was the most surprising thing you discovered as you wrote this book?
That's a good question. What's the most surprising thing? Um, I think I think it was the fact that there was such acceptance of Jimmy. Um, in my research, one of the things that I found is that Bucks County didn't have a large Black population, and most of the Black population at that time was down in Bristol. So for him to be in and amongst the mostly white communities that he was in and be accepted by the families, um, John Free invited him into the family. He stayed in the house. Um, he gave him roles of responsibility. He trusted and had faith in him and promoted him, as did all the other captains, because he had built that connection, and it didn't matter what color his skin was.
Okay, life as a canal boatman is always intrigued this questioner. Are there other first person stories?
Yes, I think that there are, but I don't know how accurate they are. Like I mean, there's Tales of the Towpath is a story, but it's a fictitious one based on other stories that are brought together. Um, uh, I largely focus my research on the oral histories and then the more historical um, factual books. So I mean, I did a heavy dive into, what would children's life on the canal be like? Were they working? And at this time, child labor was being curbed in a lot of industries, the silk industry, the iron and steel industry. But on the canals, it was because they were mostly the kids of the captains, it was less controlled. And so you did see them, and it was hard work. They were walking 20 miles a day. They were getting up before sunrise and they were walking after sunset, and they were eating as they walked. So this was not, some easy lightweight job. These kids were working really hard. So I did a lot of research along those lines, but I don't know if there might be, but that maybe not on the Delaware and Lehigh canals, maybe on the Erie or the some of the other canals.
So, a little feedback. Congratulations on this great book and all your work. Uh, this was amazing. Love the way you tied into context, including how different things would have been. Uh, this questioner would like to recommend this book to her daughter as a budding elementary school teacher. Would you think she's the reading level?
So I think you have to do that case by case. There's violence in the book, right? So that, they're trying to drown Jimmy. There are definitely occasions where um, there are um, nasty things said to him. Um, so he drinks. So it's during Prohibition. So we talk about Prohibition. Um, and there's no alcohol, so they're drinking like Sterno, basically. Um, and these are all parts of his story. So you have to decide, is it, oh, I mean, for seventh to ninth grade, the teachers all felt that this was appropriate. But if it's elementary school, I think you have to really look at it and decide if it's something that you think um, would work for that grade level.
Okay, did his family look for him after he ran away?
That's an interesting story. So, Jimmy's oral histories talk about the fact that when he takes his first trip up and back down the canal, that the captain says, "Do you want me to take you back to your house?" And he says, "Oh no, they're going to send me away to school. I'm going to get off here. You can pick me up when you come back up again." So he gets off at the Lochtander's house. He tells this story repeatedly, and he talks about the fact that he ran away, and at some point he sees his cousin or niece on the canal. We hear that his father's at one point his father dies, and he's up all the way up on the Lehigh, and one of the guys at up top of the Lehigh lets him know, but he can't get down in time for the funeral. So there's clearly some connection. But Madeline Free says that their family somehow is connected, and that maybe Jimmy didn't just randomly go and ask for a job, that there was maybe a little bit more of a parental knowledge of this happening. But he does connect with his family. He lives for a short period of time in Bristol with his sister. His nephew does come and work for him. So, and that may have happened once he was a little bit older and wasn't worried about the truancy issues and being sent away to school.
Did the Great Depression affect the canalers, or was the canal out of use by then?
The canal is done by 1931, so it really doesn't get affected by that. But it dies because of the ships, because of the trucks, because all of those things can happen. Like the canal kind of closed down in the winter because the water would freeze. Um, if there was a flood, the whole system got mucked up. So there were so many different inconsistencies in the canal world that by 1931 it just didn't make sense anymore for that to be the main thoroughfare for industry.
And how did one qualify to become a captain?
That is a really good question. I think that it was by recommendation. So I think um that there was no like test or anything like that. It was that the captains themselves recommended to the Lehigh Company that this person was capable and ready to take on that role. But they had to learn all the ropes, right? I mean, it's not like so up in the Lehigh, you did have the canals went out onto the river and came back into the canals. So there's some knowledge of the river, which is a little more complex. But really, they just needed to know the boats, they needed to know the locks, they needed to um, be safe, and Jimmy was on a boat that sank. Um, that's in the story as well. He actually went out to the Chesapeake Canal and he was loaded down with coal, and there was some kind of problem with the canal and it scratched the boat up high, and sorry, up high, but when the coal was offloaded, the boat dropped in the water. No, maybe it's reversed. But anyway, it started leaking and he almost drowned. He had to jump off the boat and the boat went down. So it was not necessarily like a super easy job. You really had to know what you were doing.
Yeah, not always that safe either. Okay. One more question. In the 1930s, the canals couldn't compete with the railroads anymore. Actually, some were owned by railroads like the Z&R Canal, and they were just abandoned when they were no longer profitable.
The railroads too were a big part of it. The less so on the Delaware and Lehigh because the it was well up north where the coal was, which is what they were trying to move. The terrain was not great for railroad. So that shifted more to a trucks for transportation. But east to west, the railroads were definitely caused, so the Delaware River and the Erie Canal, the other canal that I can't think of the name of right now that goes from like Phillipsburg out east. They all met, all three canals met right in in the eastern area. So they all connected to each other too.
Great. Well, I do not see any more questions. There were some really good questions. Oh, Morris Canal
Morris,
is a
thank you.
comment right there. And thank you for filling that in. Uh, and I do not see any more questions. So thank you, everyone, for your questions, for attending and listening. And thank you, Amy, for sharing Jimmy Brown's story.
Well, and thank you, Cindy, for inviting me to do this. I'm very excited about we will be developing a middle school program um at the Canal Museum with this and reach out to area schools. So keep your eyes open.
Yeah, please share that with us.
Hmm.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Take care all.